Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are my predictions for some upcoming legendaries from the Witchwood. Now, you might be wondering how on earth I could predict legendaries that are going to be coming out. That is because Blizzard accidentally leaked the names for a ton of cards. They put out the schedule for the upcoming streamer and community member reveals with little teaser squares for a ton of different cards, but in the process, they accidentally included the card names alongside those teaser images in the source of the HTML of the page that they publish it on. So essentially the images had alt text with the name of the card. And I know that's an accident because they later went and removed all of those names. Now it might have been an accident that was an intentional leak to build hype. Who knows? They did get this video out of it, so if that was the case, it worked. But essentially they named a ton of random cards whose names we can't really learn anything from or take any guesses based on because it's just generic stuff, you know, like Scary Tree. But they also named some legitimate Warcraft lore characters. So people who have history, people who have in-game abilities, and essentially characters which can give me some ideas about what those cards might look like. And since I know you guys are just as hyped for the Witchwood as I am, and we can't really wait to see some of these cards, I thought it might be fun to explore these characters based on the mechanics, the ideas, and the themes that have already been presented in the Witchwood so far, in combination, of course, with these characters' lore presence as well. So I went ahead and made 5 custom cards based on some of those leaked legendary names. So let's go ahead and take a look at my custom cards for the leaked legendaries in Witchwood. Up first here, let's talk about Archmage Aragal. This guy in Warcraft lore essentially is the dude who's responsible for the Worgen curse in the first place. Worgen, you know, are basically werewolves. Again, Greymane's a Worgen. He's the reason humans are turning into Worgen. And that's something I wanted to explore with his card in combination with the new Worgen effect or mechanic that Blizzard has introduced, where apparently Worgen are all about swapping your attack and your health. Normally that happens in hand, but Archmage Aragal is going to make that happen on board too because he's turning everything into Worgen. So for me, this is a mage legendary of 5 mana 5/3. The battlecry reads, transform all other minions into Worgen, then swap their attack and health. So it's a bit like a combination of a mass polymorph and a void ripper. It's going to transform everything into a Worgen that will have the same stats, then it's going to swap those stats. So essentially, if you look at something like Void Lord and Worgen here, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to start as a Void Lord of 3/9. You will transform it so it doesn't die, the death rattle doesn't go off, there's no demon death for things like Gul'dan, and then it becomes a 9/3 Worgen, which could be a pretty cool combo. You play Archmage Aragal, you can't kill a 3/9 Void Lord, but you sure can easily kill a 9/3 Worgen. Things like Dragon's Fury would be an awesome combo. Even just slinging a Frostbolt its way would suddenly set you up for a kill. So you can start to pretty quickly see how Archmage Aragal, against high health stuff and low attack stuff in particular, could set up some really cool AoE scenarios for Mage, but there's also some risk there because you don't want to leave a bunch of 9/3s on board ready to kill you either. So you have to find essentially the right sort of time or board state to play this. But to me, the most interesting aspect of Archmage Aragal is really the fact that it's a big counter to things like Q-Block. Any deck that relies super heavily on synergist cards like Void Lord, where it's all about demons or all about giant death rattle stuff, this guy is a really good counter to it. Much like Polymorph and Hex are good counters, this one's even better because it happens on a mass level. So the turn they slam that Gul'dan, guess what? You're polymorphing all of those. If they just slam 2 Void Lords early from Possessed Lackeys or Skull of Imnari, guess what? You can polymorph both of them and no longer have to deal with them. Now, you can't do it too early because you don't want to leave 9/3s lingering around, but it would still be a great answer to deny those future N'Zoth and Gul'dan power turns. Of course, that's just one example, but even against a board of Murlocs, for instance, you can stop that Murloc War Leader buff, transform all those Murlocs. They're just piles of stats instead of these really high synergy cards. It's good against things like Divine Shield even. So to me, Archmage Aragal could serve a really important almost tech answer in the meta, where it gives Mage this really powerful control tool. Still risky to use, you still have to combo it out, you still have to be smart about it, but it's just one of those things that would serve to answer a lot of the decks right now that are really dominant in the meta. So not only is this cool from a lore standpoint, a Worgen mechanic standpoint, but also I think a pretty fitting card right now as well, so I'm pretty happy with Archmage Aragal. So up next here, let's talk about Lord Godfrey. And this is essentially a dungeon boss in World of Warcraft who was all about his pistols and, in fact, pistol barrage. An ability he used, and that's something I wanted to capture in this card. So my Lord Godfrey is a rogue card. He's a 6-mana 4/4, and he has a battle cry that summons 6 ghouls. And ghouls are nothing special, they're just 1-mana 1/1s. So right off the bat, this looks a bit like a cheaper Onyxia. You get this wide board with a 4/4 in the middle, but there's another effect on Lord Godfrey at the start of your turn. Deal 6 damage randomly split among all other minions. So not just enemy minions, but all minions. So essentially he's going to summon all these dudes, but if the opponent lets Lord Godfrey live, there's a fairly good chance that he's going to, in fact, kill at least a handful of the ghouls that he just summoned. And that captures the essence of the fight against Lord Godfrey in World of Warcraft perfectly. He summons all these ghouls, and he can accidentally mow some of them down, essentially, if they get in the path of his pistol barrage. So I think I captured that pretty neatly in the card. Now, what does that mean in Hearthstone? So clearly a 6-mana card that summons 7 minions, one of which being a 4/4, would be pretty darn good. But this introduces a really cool strategic balance for both you and for your opponent. So for instance, can you play Lord Godfrey into an empty board? If your opponent doesn't have anything out there, playing a slower matchup, or you're ahead on board, then he would essentially you'd give the impetus to your opponent. They could essentially say, okay, I'll let Lord Godfrey kill all those 1/1s. No big deal. Because if there's no other minions on the board, Lord Godfrey is guaranteed to kill all of his own ghouls. So they can sort of pass the turn, maybe play a weapon instead of actually doing anything. So there are opportunities for Lord Godfrey to just backfire, because then you have a 6-mana 4/4, which is not a particularly awesome thing to do. It still does have the effect where it does 6 damage at the end of the turn, so it can benefit you, but if it's there again, you have to play minions once more, there's a chance Lord Godfrey just punishes you more than your opponent. So there's some real risk there. Alternatively, if your opponent already has a board when you play Lord Godfrey, clearly there's much more upside. If it's a Silverhand Paladin, he's going to be pinging down the other side of the board just as much as his own, and in fact could have a pretty good swing and kill all of their stuff and keep all of his ghouls alive. So then your opponent gets this position where it's like, man, do I need to kill Lord Godfrey to protect my small stuff? Do I take the risk and let him try to go even, like 50-50, because most of the time it'll be an even split. He'd kill 3 ghouls in a couple of yours, or often you'd be more favored because you'd only have 3 or 4 things, or 1 or 2 things instead of 6. So most of the time, Lord Godfrey's going to punish the rogue player more than you if you're the opponent. So you've got this dilemma. Do I kill some of the ghouls? Do I kill Lord Godfrey? Do I trade my stuff in so it doesn't get hit? Do I put Lord Godfrey down to 1 health and then just ping it down on a future turn with my hero power? There are all these different interactions and things to consider, and it becomes a real dilemma, essentially, a real pickle to figure out what you're supposed to do against Lord Godfrey. So for both players, I think there's some real strategic interactions there that are interesting. The rogue has to decide when it's safe to play Lord Godfrey, when it would be a sensible play, when it's just going to be a 6-mana 4/4 that's completely wasted. The opponent essentially gets to decide how to handle Lord Godfrey. If they just have a Flame Strike, maybe they just clear the board and call it a day. Maybe they pass the turn and let Lord Godfrey punish the rogue more than actually help the rogue. But ultimately, if things go your way, Lord Godfrey could be an amazing play. He could just kill all of the Silverhand recruits and you'd have this giant board. But thankfully, Rogue doesn't really have a lot of ways to benefit from a ton of small stuff. There's no like Power of the Wild or Mark of the Lotus available for Rogue. There are, of course, some neutral cards, and there's some Cold Bloods and things they could utilize. But most of the time, this wouldn't be the sort of card that sets up a crazy combo for Rogue. This would probably be way too good for something like Druid. But in Rogue, even if they do keep a couple ghouls alive, it's probably not going to be some overwhelming force. And most of the time, this is going to be a 4/4 that summons, 3 1/1s, which compared to something like Spiteful Summoner, clearly not quite as powerful, but I still think good and interesting, and the potential for this card is there. Not to mention the fact that I think this captures the character of Lord Godfrey almost perfectly in at least the World of Warcraft combat sense. So I like that aspect quite a bit. So up next I want to talk about Toki. Now, as far as I can tell, Toki is not actually a Warcraft lore character, so I think this is one that the Hearthstone team created, which they do a lot. But because of the artwork of the card and the name of the card, we can still figure out a little bit about Toki and what she's going to be all about. So in the artwork here, you can see that this is a gnome that's holding a watch. If you look very closely in the actual teaser image here in the middle of your screen, which implies that she's one of two things, maybe a gnome tinkerer of some sort, but I think, in fact, probably a member of the Bronze Dragonflight like Chromie. So I think quite clearly Toki as a character is going to have something to do with time or manipulating time. Now, I've already proposed a Chromie video or Chromie card in a past video, which I could have just copied here and called it Toki and called it a day, but I wanted to explore the idea of manipulating time once again, and that's what I've done with the custom version of Toki here. This is a neutral legendary. It's a 5-mana 1/1, which obviously is garbage, but it has a start of game effect. You get 2 chances to mulligan at the start of the game. So in other words, you get your original set of cards, like you do in any mulligan. You choose to keep a couple, okay? And normally 2 new cards come in and that completes your hand. But with Toki, the 2 new cards would come in and you'd essentially get a chance to mulligan again. You'd be able to pass on or keep all 4 cards. So you could keep a couple. If you get that mana worm, you want to keep it for sure. You pass back the other 3. 3 new cards come up. You see another mana worm and you're like, oh, I'm keeping the second mana worm too. And then you X out the remaining 2 cards. They go away. And then finally 2 more come up. So essentially it gives you 2 full mulligans at the start of the game, which is going to greatly increase the likelihood that you get cards you want. So there are certain decks that are particularly reliant on early game cards and fast starts that could utilize Toki very, very effectively to get off to a quick start. And of course, she's basically like rewinding time or giving you a redo on your mulligan. So thematically, pretty cool and appropriate, but also strategically super valuable. I think a lot of Hearthstone players still to this day underestimate the importance of the mulligan, and a card like Toki could really reinforce that because she'd make your deck so much more consistent. Now, the downside, of course, for Toki is that you have to run a 5-mana 1/1, and I think her effect would be most valuable in an aggressive deck, and it would help increase the consistency of your mulligan, but suddenly you're making your draw consistency much worse because sometimes you're just going to draw a 5-mana 1/1, which is functionally an unplayable card. So you're sacrificing mid to late game draw value consistency for early game mulligan consistency, and that's a fairly notable downside. You just can't, in an aggro deck, spend one of your draws getting a 5-mana 1/1. That's just a complete waste. But if your mulligan and your start is good enough to make up for that often enough, then you'd be okay to put Toki in your deck. So it just depends on the deck and what they need and how fast they have to start, or if they need some sort of specific combo cards to really become powerful. Toki's the sort of card that could enable that. So not something I would expect necessarily every deck to run, like a value late game deck probably couldn't afford to just run a Toki in their deck. It would just kill their value too much. They'd be losing one card that would add a lot of late game depth and power to their deck, which may not be worth it for the increase in mulligan because they don't usually have that many great mulligan options anyway. But a hyper aggro deck that needs to get off to the perfect start, suddenly Toki makes more sense. Maybe you draw her, though, as your 5th card and she just completely costs you the game sometimes. That's fine. That's the penalty and the price you have to pay to get off to faster and better starts sometimes. So this might be an anti-aggro player's nightmare in some ways if you hate aggro decks, because you'd never really know that your opponent drew Toki and that they were punished for running Toki. But you'd never really know that they had Toki either because you wouldn't really see how many times they'd mulligan, so maybe you wouldn't feel all that bad. But I still think it'd be a cool interaction and a fun card for people to run who wanted to live a little dangerously, live on the edge for a potential small gain with also a potential high risk as well. And of course, I like the idea of manipulating time, or at least sort of challenging some of the core ways a Hearthstone game operates. It's such a waste how Blizzard doesn't manipulate the digital aspect of Hearthstone enough. They could do so many fun and cool and nifty things because the game exists in a digital sphere, and they don't seem to do that all that often, but Toki would be a pretty neat way to start doing that, I think. So up next here we have Darius Crowley, who is probably the 2nd most famous Worgen character in Warcraft. I'm sure that's debatable, but he's one of the more popular named Gilnean characters. And in this case, I'm making Darius Crowley a warrior card, and this is an 8-mana 2/10, pretty crazy stat line. And essentially this card does two things. First off, even though it's second on the card, this is a Worgen card, which swaps its attack and health every turn it's in your hand. So on turn 7, this is a 2/10. On turn 8, it might be a 10/2, depending on when you draw it, or vice versa. But also Darius Crowley, you'll note he has these giant claw hands. I mean, those are not his real hands. He's wearing essentially fist weapons with giant claws. And in the game, he's sort of a meme that he's great at cleaving stuff. And essentially, I added cleave to this card where his attacks damage all enemy minions. So if he attacks the opponent's face, it's also going to cleave essentially to every enemy minion on the board. If he has to attack a taunt minion, it's going to attack the taunt minion, but also cleave to every other minion on the board. It will not hit face if he attacks a taunt minion, which is important because otherwise you could give this card, or you could combo this card with charge for a board clear and face damage, which we don't want. So it's important that it only affects minions. But essentially, with Darius Crowley here, I wanted to explore the idea of one of these Worgen cards that swaps its attack and health having some huge upside if you play it at the right time and it's able to attack with that super high attack value, and that's exactly what Darius Crowley does. Because if you're able to get this onto the board as a 10/2 minion, and you're able to attack face with it, that is like the best play ever, because you're doing 10 face damage, which is fantastic, but you're also doing 10 damage to the board, so it's like this huge AoE effect as well. And that's absurd, that's crazy good. But the problem is, in order to orchestrate that sort of turn, it's almost impossible, because you have to find the exact right moment to play a 2 health minion where it could somehow seemingly survive. And that's doubly challenging because remember, this is swapping every turn. So it might line up at some point as far as a board state. It's like, man, I know they don't have a Shadow over Death. I know they don't have any AoE. This is my turn to play Darius Crowley. It's going to live on the board. The priest can't kill it, but it's a 2/10, so it doesn't matter. You can't do what you want. So you've got to find this exact right moment to manipulate all of these factors to work, which would be really challenging. And even then, it has to survive, right? 2 health minion would be incredibly susceptible to death. But, of course, there are some other things. You could play this as a 2/10. And even then, it's really, really good. It's like a consecration to your opponent's board every time. Now, it's a slow play because you slam an 8-mana card. It doesn't have taunt. It's not instantly impacting the board. Your opponent could just kill you while you spend 8 mana playing Darius Crowley. So it's one of those things that takes a little bit to snowball into some real value. If they have 5 health minions out there, guess what? Darius Crowley is useless. So it's not good in many scenarios, but when it works, it could work big time. And of course, Warrior also has things like Cruel Taskmaster, for instance, where you could buff Darius Crowley's attack value. You could give it 4 attack, and then it becomes this Flame Strike every turn. That could be pretty cool. Also, I think this would be a great card for recruit effects. Currently, Control Warrior just isn't able to utilize recruit very successfully in this meta. But with cards like Darius Crowley, you don't want to spend the mana on it. That would suck. But if you got a 2/10 on board that your opponent suddenly couldn't really deal with very effectively because it has so much health, then boom, you could get that free consecration every turn. But I just really like the idea of the potential upside, the interactions of getting this thing to work. Once it's on board, it becomes a monster, a value piece in a controlled deck. It could just do so much removal and so much AoE, so much potentially face damage even on its own. You could still combo with something like the card Charge, essentially, to do a 10 damage board wipe, but you'd probably lose your Darius Crowley in the process, and a 2-card board wipe for 9 mana honestly isn't that good anyway. So once again, as I always say, I don't really know if the numbers are perfect here. Maybe the cost could be different. Maybe you tweak the numbers to a 3/9 or 3/8. I don't know. I don't really care too much about that. I'm more interested in the idea of a card that really benefits from its Worgen status and can do some cool, different, or super powerful things if you're able to play it the right scenario and play it at the right time, and it swaps health in the right way, then suddenly it becomes this absolute powerhouse sort of card, and I think that's exactly what Darius Crowley would do. It also fits Warrior thematically as a sort of AoE card, a big late game control style minion that's all about using, power and force. So I'm on board for Darius Crowley here. I'm curious what you guys have to say, but I like this card quite a bit. And now finally here I have one last card. This is Emrys, and Emrys is one of the corrupted green dragonflight dragons. She was famously in the Dragons of Nightmare back in vanilla World of Warcraft. There were these 4 dragons that were corrupted and you could go fight them. They were basically like world raid boss kind of characters. And for Emrys, her deal was she would spawn a mushroom on any character that died, and then that mushroom would do damage to characters near it. So essentially in the fight, if somebody died, which was a problem anyway, it snowballed out of control, because as soon as they died, it was pretty likely somebody next to them wasn't paying attention, and then that person would die, and then it would just chain over and over again, and everybody would be dead before long. And that's precisely what I wanted to capture with this card. So Emrys is a 9-mana, 4/12 druid card, and she reads, whenever a minion dies, summon a putrid mushroom in its place. And this, as I'm sure you've been wondering, is a putrid mushroom. It's a 1-mana 1/1, and its death rattle reads, deal 4 damage to adjacent minions. So, first things first, Emrys is really slow as a 9-mana 4/2, and you can't really combo her out with many other things. She's got that kind of Malagos or Ysera stat line, where she doesn't do much right away, but of course, a 12 health minion's really hard for most opponents to deal with, and essentially if you give her time on board to work, and she survives for a turn or 2, chaos is going to ensue. Because she will probably be able to trade into a minion, or you'll have a swipe or some other card to clear a minion, which is going to start a putrid mushroom train, is what I'm calling it. And then, of course, Druid's hero power is really good at killing putrid mushrooms. So she kills an opponent's minion. Say they have 4 minions on board. She kills one of the middle minions, right? And then a putrid mushroom spawns. And then the Druid hero power hits the putrid mushroom, which then kills the 2 adjacent minions. Now remember, all of those minions are minions dying. Putrid mushrooms dying also spawn putrid mushrooms. So there's this chain now. There's 3 putrid mushrooms on the left side of the board. And if you could kill that other putrid mushroom, it would be 4 putrid mushrooms on the board. And then you pass the turn back to your opponent, and they have this like super dilemma where it's like, oh my god, what do I do now? My minions, anytime they die, are basically all just cannibalizing themselves, but also I have infinite minions on board, because every time one dies, it gets replaced. So there's a million strategic implications here about the correct ways to trade, the right ways to position your minions. Do you put a high health thing in the middle so it stays alive against multiple putrid mushrooms? Do you put it on the left or the right side, based on the kind of cards you expect your druid to play? Do you put everything into killing Emrys so you can stop dealing with this? Or do you maybe leave Emrys alive because she keeps giving you an infinite series of minions? Even though the putrid mushrooms are blowing themselves up constantly, you're always getting more putrid mushrooms. So I just like the chaos that ensues, and it gives Druid an interesting way to control the board in a way, because essentially if you do it correctly and your opponent doesn't have the right sorts of things to play, then you can guarantee that everything your opponent has eventually is going to be a 1/1, until Emrys dies at least, at which point the chaos finally subsides. But I like that Druid is so good at 1/1s. They're great with things like Spreading Plague and Swipe. This starts to synergize really well with Druid. Also, Druid has trouble with bigger, higher health AoE damage. They really can only do those smaller chunks at a single time. But Putrid Mushrooms are basically kind of flame strikes in a bottle, because they're dealing 4 damage to stuff instead of just 1. So it could really help Druid deal with higher health things and wider boards. Now, of course, again, Emrys is really slow. Remember, this is a slow 9-mana card. She doesn't do anything the turn you play her. It's very unlikely you can kill a minion the same turn you play Emrys, unless, of course, you're already ahead on the board and ahead in the game and you have minions on board, in which case, you're probably going to win anyway. But also remember, your minions turn into mushrooms too, so there's some risk there as well. This is not just enemy minions. This is any minion is going to turn into a mushroom. So even if you are ahead and you start trading in, you have to be careful yourself. You could accidentally kill your own Emrys too. But with Druid's ability to ramp, they can play slower cards. These sorts of things can find success. There might be a deck that could really work quite well with Emrys, or a meta that's really good with Emrys too. So I love the idea of this card. I don't know if it would actually work. It's another one of those things that probably would need a ton of testing and some number refinement. But I absolutely love the idea of what Emrys could do. And there you have it, guys. Those are my 5 custom versions of the leaked legendary cards from Witchwood. I'm curious what you guys have to say. I'm sure I introduced some totally broken combo that I didn't foresee, and everybody's going to tell me and yell at me and make fun of me. as is seemingly the case lately, but that's okay. I don't care. I still have fun doing these videos. I still have fun thinking through cards and introducing neat interactions and fun mechanics, and of course exploring the lore of Warcraft a little bit through card design as well. So all that said, of course, leave your thoughts in the comments below, but until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.